Well, again, it's so good to be with you this morning, and I want to say also welcome to those who are with us online today. It's a blessing every time we're able to gather like this, and on a beautiful day, no less, to worship God and listen to His Word. So today we're getting back into the series that we began 2 weeks ago, a series that we're calling Tune Up, as we take a look under the hood, so to speak, of our lives of faith and ask a few check-in questions about the life that we're living as people preparing for the road ahead, tuning up our lives to play our part in God's plan for us. I really appreciate Colby Wallace and what he had to share with us last week as he helped us to think about preparing for doing God's work and trusting in Him and His timing from Acts chapter 27 and the way he continued our series forward last week. You know, I mentioned to you before that, in almost every aspect of our lives, it's important to have these moments of check-in, these moments of tune-up. And that's especially true, when you have more than one thing working together, and those things need to be working in harmony. It's so important then that we take time to stop and take time to look and listen and make adjustments as we need to in order to keep things on track and in tune. And I gave you a few examples of that last time. We talked about sports teams and sports cars. We talked about surgeons and nurses working together in an operating room. We even took a little trip to the symphony, and I proved to you how sophisticated I am. And I guess I didn't learn my lesson last week because I actually have another musical-related example for you. You may have thought, based on the symphony story I told you last time, that I have just no musical background whatsoever, and I would not blame you for that, but that would be wrong. Because, in fact, you are looking today at the first chair saxophone player in the 5th grade beginner band. First chair out of 2 chairs. And it just so happened that the other saxophone player forgot his instrument at home on the day that they assigned the chairs. But it still counts, first chair. I am no Spencer Markham on the saxophone, but I still count it anyway. And sadly, I didn't stick with saxophone long enough to really learn a skill from it, but I did have an embarrassing moment or two. And I remember one day in particular, we were in band practice right after lunch. Our band director was up front leading us, Mr. Donut. That's really what he was called. His name was Don Utley, and he put those together to be Mr. Donut. He was a wholesome man. And Mr. Donut was up front. And he was leading us in this song that we had never played together as a group before. We were supposed to have practiced it the night before, but then now we were coming together as a beginner band to try to play this song with one another. So he raises his arms and we begin to play. And I had practiced the night before like I was supposed to, but I was still a little shaky, and so I'm really nervous now. I don't want to mess this up for the whole group, so let me tell you, I am just locked in. I am staring a hole into my sheet music, and my head is down, and I'm following each and every note on that page, and I was so focused on playing my part that I failed to see when Mr. Donut up front gave us one of these, which is supposed to end the song. I was so locked in on my part that I failed to even notice that everybody else in the band had stopped playing the music. And so here I am playing this shaky beginner saxophone solo, not realizing that I'm the only one playing it all. And the worst part was, at the very end of the song was one of those, you music people can help me with this, but one of those little notations where you're supposed to just hold that note until they tell you to stop. And that was the first time I thought maybe I should look up at the band director. And so here I am holding that note, and Mr. Donut is clearly amused by this, I think, because he just keeps letting me hold that note until finally I realize this song's been over for a while, and I am the only one still playing this song. And I had gotten so focused on me and what I was doing that I failed at all to look up at the person I was supposed to be following. And I also, because of that, really just lost sight of all the others who were with me, this band that I was supposed to be playing with. And I wonder if it's sometimes like that with us in our lives of faith. Specifically, I wonder if it's sometimes like that as in the way that we as Christians relate to our neighbors. And that's what I want to talk about and focus on today with our check-in question in this series as we're tuning up. And we're entering this time, of course, where we have just like more and more opportunity perhaps to interact and have those person-to-person connections than maybe we had before. And so as we enter into this time of renewed opportunity, the question I want to ask us is, how are we doing in relating with our neighbors? How are we doing with relating with the people? And maybe it's not the person literally next door, though it could be them, but the people in your life who share a life with you but don't share a pew with us here, and maybe don't even share our faith at all. How about our neighbors? How do we want to be relating to our neighbors? What should that relationship look like? And as I wrestled with this topic, the two words that really just kind of rose to the surface of my mind were these. When it comes to our relationship with our neighbors, are we distant or are we distinct? Distant or distinct? Is the goal to be distant? Or is the goal to be distinct? Now, those words might sound kind of similar to us, and they look similar, and in some ways that they are, but in fact, they're not the same, are they? What makes them different? Maybe we can think of it this way. First, when we think of that word distance, I'd like for us to think of it today as a relationship word. It's a word for how close together or how far away and separate one thing might be to another. And of course, we use distance to talk about physically distant, like, Dallas is 32 miles from Fort Worth. But we can also talk about things being distant in terms of relationship, or distant socially, or distant emotionally one to another. A good example might be the two college roommates who live a whole semester 10 feet from one another, but sometimes roommates are just not that close. You might share a room with one another, but maybe they don't share inside jokes, they don't hang out, they don't share secrets with one another. We might think of distant as a word for relationship. How close, how separate, how related, how connected. Meanwhile, there's this other word, distinct. And distinct is not exactly about how close or how separate. Distinct is more about how alike and how different, right? I might call it more of an identity word. So, for example, you think about all those musicians who are in the band. They're all sitting in the same room, and they're all playing the same song at the same time, but they're not all playing the same instrument, and they're certainly not all just blaring out and droning out one single note. Now, within that band, although they're all drawn in together, there are these distinct identities, these distinct parts to play. And the saxophone player doesn't try to play the trumpet line, and they really shouldn't try to play by themselves. That's not what makes them distinct. You can play your distinct role even within the band. Distinct is an identity word. How similar, how different. How true to character. How defined in purpose. So I guess the question becomes, which are we when it comes to our relationships with our neighbors? Maybe the question should be, what's our goal moving forward? What's the goal there? Distinct or distant? Because if I can speak from my own experience here and even my struggle here, and I would just say this is kind of my observation generally, is that an easy default mode to drift into is the one of being distant from our neighbors, but not all that distinct. That's one way of relating to our neighbors, and it can be kind of an easy one to drift into, where we're not really so connected with the people in our lives, and yet at the same time, may not even also be that distinct either in the way of life that we're living. And that can be something I drift into too, especially when, like my young saxophone playing self, I get so caught up in myself and what I'm doing that I fail to look up and see the one I'm following. I fail to look around and see who's all around me. And we could talk about all the reasons why it's easy for us to be like this, distant, but not necessarily distinct in the world that we live in today. But I think I'd rather spend our time focused on some words of Scripture for the rest of the time that we have together. So I've chosen 4 teachings for us today that really get at the heart of this question for me about relating with our neighbors, and I want us to take a look. I'm going to read these slowly. Let these words sink in. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out, trampled underfoot. That's Matthew 5:13. The very next teaching, verse 14. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. So in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father who's in heaven. This one's from 2 Corinthians. If anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. And then one last one, a story from the life of Jesus, Matthew 9. As Jesus went out from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth. Follow me, he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. And while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and they ate with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? You remember what Jesus said? Verse 12. On hearing this, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Now let me ask you this morning, what do those 4 teachings that we just looked at together have in common? What do they all share? And what does it have to do with distance? What does it have to do with distinctiveness? Think about what we've just heard. Think about the salt in Jesus' first teaching. What makes salt useful? If not, it's distinctiveness, right? Like that's really Jesus' point in the passage. He says if salt loses that saltiness, that character of being salt, well then it's no longer good for anything, Jesus says. It can no longer do what it's able to do. It doesn't make food flavorful anymore. It doesn't help to preserve food like in the old days. It won't even help you when your driveway is icy. If it loses that saltiness, that distinctive quality. And Jesus says that if you lose your distinctiveness, then we lose our usefulness. But let me ask you this also. When is it that salt is useful? Where and how does it make a difference? It's not just when it's sitting in the salt shaker, is it? And if you've ever had that experience of sitting down at the table and you start to eat and you realize, I forgot to salt this, then when salt's not mixed in it, then it's not making a difference. And if the salt is not mixed into that bag of Lay's potato chips, then I probably can eat just one. But that salt is what makes the difference there. it must contain that distinctiveness, but it makes a difference when it's in it, when it's mixed up in there. That's when it enriches. That's when it elevates the food. Very next teaching, what good is a light if you put it, like we sing in the song, if you hide it under the bushel? What good is a light? I don't even know what a bushel is. Is it a plant? Is it a bowl? But it doesn't really matter because the point is the same as with the salt. The light has to continue to be a light if it's going to be useful. Its essence of giving light, that's what makes it distinct and good. And if somebody just puts it out, then it's not useful anymore. But just like with the salt, where and how and when is the light useful? You wouldn't even light the lamp at all unless you needed it, unless it was lighting up the dark. That's when the light makes a difference, when it is connected to it, when it's in those places where it can give light where there is none. Think about the ambassador. An ambassador is not an ambassador if they forget where home is. If they decide to be citizens of another country once they're out there somewhere else, then they're not an ambassador anymore. Even if they just don't do a very good job representing their homeland, then they're not really being an ambassador, because that's what ambassadors are. They're people that go somewhere and then they represent a certain country or a certain way of life, and so they have to be distinct. They have to stand out as being a person who represents this place. But just like with the salt, just like with the light, an ambassador isn't really an ambassador if they just stay home either. The when and how and where of them being an ambassador means going to that place where they can stand out and represent. You see where I'm going with this. Jesus said in the last teaching, he called himself a doctor. And this one is a little different than the other three. It's a story and not a teaching. It doesn't directly say, like the other ones, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. We are the ambassadors. It's about what Jesus did. But I'll tell you one thing. I'm not too jazzed to visit the doctor who's no different than I am. If I'm sick, I want a doctor who can help me with that. Someone who understands my illness, but also who's skilled enough and compassionate enough to help me. I want the doctor I see to be distinct. If they just bring to the table what I have, then I'm no better than before. But also, I don't want the hospital where the sick aren't welcome, because that's where the doctor makes a difference. And Jesus says it's not the healthy who need that doctor, but the sick. Really what he's saying is the same thing as with the salt, the same thing as with the light, the same as with the ambassador. As easy as it can be for me to slip into this relationship with my neighbors where I am distant from them, but maybe not all that distinct, what we see in these teachings is that our calling is actually quite the opposite. The salt, the light, the ambassador, the doctor, they all share in common that if they lose their distinctness, their distinct purpose, well, then they're no longer useful in the way that they could be. But the salt and the light and the ambassador and the doctor, they all share that in common too, that when they are useful is when they are not separate, not distant, but when they're right there where they're supposed to be. That's when they can do all that they're meant to do. That's when they enrich and enlighten and inspire and heal. And as we think about our future together, about what God might do with us, we may think about this question too. Distant or distinct? Which one will we strive to be? Can we be like the salt of the earth and the light of the world and maintain our distinctiveness while we serve our purpose? Can we be like the ambassador who remembers that whatever place he's living in is not true home, but that actually the ambassador is representing a different way of life, a different citizenship? Can we look to and follow our leader, the great physician? Follow in his way and see his compassion to heal and serve and save? Can we fix our eyes on him and remember that we're just one instrument, one small but distinct part to play in all that God is doing? Jesus said that the love of neighbor is right up there with the love of God as like the greatest commandment that there is. I wonder if we might learn today that the best love we can offer for our neighbor is distinct, but not distant, as we play our part in what God has called us to do. I'll close with this. Maybe this lesson is speaking to you and challenging you like it does me. The past 2 weeks, Colby and I have finished off our lesson by talking about some real-life people in different congregations around the country who have kind of embraced the certain themes that we've been looking at each week, these tune-up questions that we've been working on. And I hope that's kind of a defining quality of this series that we're doing. As I was driving to church today, I thought that there may be a different example that we could learn from today. About 3 years ago, I remember very well a conversation that I had with Lawrence Ward. He was giving me some wisdom for the life of ministry. And this is what he said. I don't remember exactly what he said, but it's kind of the point. So what he said to me was, at the end of the day, people won't remember exactly the words that you used. They may not ever remember exactly what you did. What they'll remember is the way that they felt when you were around them. That's what Lawrence said. That's also how Lawrence lived. And I wonder if that's maybe like the applicable way, one of the things we can take with us for how to live this calling in our lives. Because the person who makes a difference in the way that you feel when you're around them is a person whose life is different, whose life is distinct, called to something more. But to make that difference, you can't just be separate. You got to be with them where they are. Maybe somebody needs to respond to the gospel today. It's no coincidence that what we love most about Jesus is the fact that he lived differently, and he truly was distinct. He was sinless in his life, of course, but also his love was greater, and his compassion just stood out in the way he lived, his courage and his wisdom. They were not like what the world had seen before, and because he was distinct and different, we know God in a way that we couldn't before. And also we have this hope. But Jesus was not just distinct from us, but in a way that God had never done before, he drew near to us, bridged the distance, entered our lives, entered human flesh, even entered the problem of sin, that he might save us from it. And maybe today your response is to the God who gave his life for you in distinctive love, drawing near to save us from sin and death. However you may be called or challenged today, we invite you to respond while we stand and while we sing.